Welcome to another episode of the Student Loan Planner Podcast. I'm Travis Hornsby, your fearless host, and today we are going to talk about how to make it to the next rung of the economic ladder. So that sounds kind of like a weird topic for today's show, and partly it's because of the implied assumption that getting to the next rung of the economic ladder is a good thing. It might not necessarily be a good thing. The old sort of cliche, more money, more problems, I forget exactly who came up with that, but it is, some regards kind of true if you let the next level of the economic ladder stress you out. So I think that there are some good reasons to make it to the next rung of the economic ladder. And when we talk about making it to that next level, a lot of times people think about society in terms of working class, middle class, wealthy, right? Like people kind of think in terms of those artificial sort of breaking points about how good your life is going to be at each different level. With those kind of caveats in mind, like what I really want you to get out of this is to kind of identify where you're at currently and say, how do you do better financially? So obviously, most of the people listening to this podcast have student loans, so this is going to be in the context of this, of having student loan debt. But we're going to talk about basically how do you become wealthier, kind of emphasizing what we talked about on last week's show about how to grow your wealth through investing. Obviously, there is a political path where programs and government action could help people move up the economic ladder. But for this episode, we're going to focus on what you can do specifically. The reason why I think that's a good topic to focus on is because if we look at something very recently, the failure of Congress to extend the eviction moratorium and the failure of the White House to extend the eviction moratorium, I think it's pretty clear that sometimes good things can happen where Washington can surprise you in terms of looking out for your interests, but more often than not, you're going to be disappointed. It just seems like that's how it works. So that said, we're going to talk about if you're poor, lower middle class, and upper middle class. So I think a maybe better version of the term poor is just working class, or the working poor is what some people will say about that. But I'll say in general, this is just my own definitions and they're arbitrary. If you're poor, you, let's say, make around the poverty line plus or minus a little bit, right? So $20,000 as an individual, $25,000, $30,000 as a family, something like that. Lower middle class, let's say that's $40,000, $50,000. Now, interestingly enough, $50,000 is actually not lower middle class. If you ask people what sort of class do they fall in or socioeconomic group do they fall in, most people will say lower middle class or middle class, even people that are not at all in the lower middle class or middle class. So for example, $50,000 or $60,000 is the median household income in America for a family. So if you're making $50,000 as an individual, by definition, you're kind of in the upper portion of the middle class, even though it certainly doesn't feel that way. And of course, places in San Francisco, being upper middle class means something different than being upper middle class in like rural Iowa too, right? So that's why I said that these definitions are sort of arbitrary, right? So you've got like 20, 30K, working poor, lower middle class, say 30 to 50 or 60K, middle class, let's call that 60 to 120, and then say upper middle class, let's just say it's anything that's comfortably into the six figures. And you're not just barely breaking six figures, but you're comfortably making six figures a year and can expect to kind of keep that way. So let's start if you're working poor. What are some important things for you to do to reach financial security and to try to break into that lower middle class level? If you are in the working poor, the first thing I would do is, and this is just a reality here, but if you are upper middle class, how much you spend on things like lattes and going out to eat and things like that really don't matter that much compared to your housing and your car expenses. That's really by far and away the most important thing. However, if you are in that poverty line up to twice the poverty line level, then those kind of items actually do matter quite a lot. And so then I would track your spending. Step one would be tracking your spending in mint.com. So if you could track your spending in mint.com, you'll identify transactions and you will spend less without even realizing it. We see this in our consulting clients where people will spend, maybe a third less just by having their spending tracked and just being aware of what they are spending on. This is especially true in families because if you have a quarterly meeting even about what you spend, you're going to find a lot of things that you just spent that you didn't really find a ton of value in, but you didn't really think about it much. So for example, maybe my wife is not as aware of the this is pre-pandemic, but the places that I would go to see sporting events, right? Maybe that's a thing that I do with friends and I spend money on that. She doesn't ask a lot of questions. Maybe for her, she spends money on nice clothes and doesn't really I don't ask a lot of questions about that. But pretty quickly, if you're kind of both doing your own thing, you don't talk about it, suddenly you have a pretty large expense to deal with. So step one is track your spending. Step two, if you're working poor, is you want to make sure that you've got some level, some floor of income and health insurance. So that's one of the most common reasons to go bankrupt, I think even still, is medical expenses and unexpected kind of big ticket items like that. So to cover your housing, health insurance needs, things like that. So you could look at Section 8 housing vouchers. That's one option to get some rental assistance coming in. If you're disabled, you could apply for Social Security disability. So maybe if you've ever watched Law and Order reruns on cable television, I used to do that in college, you would have all these Social Security disability lawyers on TV that would be advertising their services. They take a percentage of your winnings if they get you approved for Social Security disability, I think, in most cases. But if you were unable to work, then trying to get Social Security disability, that's actually the floor level of income for a lot of people around the country. You've seen an increase in like 50-something-year-olds that apply for this, even people in their 40s. Basically, it's people that a lot of times it's structurally unemployed. People can't find jobs, or they have back problems or medical problems that prevent them from working the same hours that they'd like to work. And so people will reach out for Social Security disability in a lot of cases out of desperation. So you would want to apply for something if you are eligible for it. Let's say that you're making $25,000 a year, $20,000 a year, and you're very healthy. Well, in that case, one really nice thing about the ACA exchange, kind of more popularly known as Obamacare, is you can sign up for incredibly good health insurance if you are low income, particularly if you're in this zone where you make too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but you make not enough money where you don't get subsidies anymore. That's kind of the sweet spot. And in particular, I think around like 150% of the poverty line is a really sweet spot. So in terms of if you are around 150% of the poverty line, you can get something called cost-sharing assistance. For the ACA, what that does is it gives you deductibles as small as $500 and copays as small as like $5 or $10 to see a specialist. It's honestly incredible. My brother is sort of a semi-employed actor, and he got on the ACA exchange and got a silver plan with cost-sharing. My mother-in-law got cost-sharing assistance through the ACA exchange with a silver plan. And I have to say that the only thing better than a silver plan where you're getting the maximum subsidies is like being on a union healthcare plan that they just pay for everything. I mean, it's a really, really good health insurance program. Pretty much most people are going to take it because I guess Medicaid seemingly is taken by fewer places. But I think that the ACA plans that you're on when you're on the silver plan aren't necessarily viewed in that same category, so more people take it. So it's sort of like if you're working poor, track your expenses, get good health coverage. Then you'd want to look at your debts. So you'd want to see if your debts are surmountable or not. Sometimes people might have a ton of credit card debt or personal loans or something, and it's okay to talk about settling them and maybe starting over if it's really not something that you could handle. So if it's really not something you could handle, you could meet with a consumer law attorney and see if it makes sense to settle it or bankrupt it or pay it back. But here's step 4, which I like the most, because it's the best option if you can do it. Increase your earnings. So remember, if you're a student loan borrower, let's say you're working poor and you have $20,000 or $30,000 in student loan debt, and you're not making a very high income, probably one of the worst things you could do is not go back to school. Sounds kind of weird, right? You've already got 20 or 30K in debt. Why would I go back to school and get additional debt? Well, let me tell you a story about somebody that I know. He is somebody that's been having some problems just in his life, and he had 20, 30, 40,000 type of debt, making a low income, sort of working a lower income job. And then the suggestion I had for him was go back to school and get an MBA. And he thought for a second, well, are you crazy? Why would you do that? And the answer is because if you can pay 10% of your income, then what matters is your net income after your student loan payments, not your absolute debt. So to take that a step further, for example, let's say you're making $30,000 a year and you've got $30,000 of student loans. Well, your income-based payment might be $100 a month. Maybe you would get some money forgiven, probably not, but let's say that hypothetically, you get a little forgiven with that kind of an income and debt profile. Well, worst case scenario, your payment's 10% of your income. It'll be less than that because of the deductions. But say you lose 10% of $30,000, so your net income after student loans would be $27,000. So imagine now instead of $30,000 of debt, let's say you go to an online master's program at a decent school, not a top 3, but some sort of decent state school that's got a decent track record of getting people into pretty decent jobs. And let's say you had to borrow $150,000 to make it happen. So now our guy's got $180,000 of debt. If his income is even 10% higher than if he had not gotten an MBA, then that made sense to do that. So for example, let's say he's making $50,000 a year after his MBA, lose 10% of that, that's $45,000. 45 is much better than 27. So if I'm in the working poor, one of my top suggestions to someone, even if they already have student loan debt, is to go get a more advanced degree. That's what the current incentive structure rewards. The reality is a lot of these programs that might normally cap their seats are instead interested in maximizing their revenue as schools. And so they're taking advantage of a flawed student loan system to gain higher revenues by charging people very high fees for their student loan programs, meaning that they create extra seats in professions. That's probably not good for the profession overall, right? Because it leads to a greater supply, and then because there's greater supply, there's lower earnings than there would be otherwise. But if you're somebody that is in a lower income level looking to increase it, it's one of the best things you can possibly do. It makes sense, too, if you are making a lower income to go into a job that's nonprofit or governmental, eligible for public service loan forgiveness, right? I mean, imagine having a $30K a year job and having 30 or 40K of student loan debt. Well, would you rather keep that for 20 years and have it be forgiven and possibly be taxable income, or would you rather go get a job as a nurse, go back to like a program like that, or maybe you could go to sort of a mid-tier law school or something if you could, or obviously get a bachelor's degree first. I'm kind of assuming that you already have a bachelor's degree. But to go to one of these programs that's really employment specific and has a decent track record of getting people into jobs, which most grad schools actually do publish employment statistics that you could review. And that's going to be one of the best things you could possibly do. Now, if you are in the working poor, you need an emergency fund. So this is something that I didn't know until I wrote a book a few years ago that didn't sell a ton of copies. It was pre-student loan planner. And it was about the interest rates that different kinds of lenders charge. So I found out that pawn shops, a typical interest rate they might charge is around 100%, and then payday loan places can be around 400%. The working poor use these places in normal economic times all the time. So if you think about what's happened with the child tax credit expansion, the unemployment supplemental money that has been given out, the stimulus checks, these places luckily have been used less the past year and a half. Eventually, a lot of that support's going to get cut off, and those things are going to roar back because they kind of always do, unfortunately. Now, to avoid having to ever utilize those places, obviously you're not going to grow a lot of wealth if you're paying a negative 100% to negative 400% return to somebody else. So the next thing you need to do is build an emergency fund. Get any kind of savings in the bank that you can. Try to save 5% into some kind of retirement account. So that's not a lot of money if you break it up into a per paycheck kind of thing. So if you're working, you're working for yourself, making $30,000 a year, 5% is $1,500 a year. So that's a little bit more than $100 a month. You could maybe say it's about $50 a paycheck. $50 a paycheck is not easy to some families. I recognize that, but consider that it's like $2 a day. So in other words, if you have one fewer coffee or one fewer Coke or vending machine trip a day, then that's something that could substantially start your journey on retirement savings. One thing that can happen sometimes is when you have a lower income, you lose some of these benefits if you make more income. So sometimes people are worried about that because if you lose your health insurance, that's very stressful if you have a family. Long term, that's going to pay off. And maybe not in the short run, but long term, it's going to pay off making that higher income. And it is worth it always to make more money as long as you enjoy the work. It's kind of like going for loan forgiveness. You never want to go for loan forgiveness just because. That's because you always want to try to make more money if you can, if you enjoy the work. Not if you feel like you have to make more money. That's not a good reason. But if you enjoy working more and making more, then go do it. So now let's talk about lower middle class, how you level up to that middle class level from lower middle class. So my dad described himself as lower middle class. That was how he self-identified. He was a teacher and he had a master's degree. It's kind of interesting that he would call himself lower middle class because, that's sort of a definition by income level versus education level. Think about a college professor. That's some of the smartest people out there, yet they would be middle class by many financial measures. I don't know exactly about these arbitrary definitions, right? But let's talk about what people in the lower middle class kind of tend to do. So my dad had a pension, but really didn't invest anywhere. He made a big mistake of leaving his sick leave money that he got for not going out sick as often. He left that instead of being invested, he left it in a money market account, which is just like one of the worst things you can possibly do. So he left it in a money market account where it got 1% interest or something like that instead of it being invested in the markets and growing over time. People in the lower middle class tend to get most of their retirement income from either Social Security or some sort of small pension. A lot of times people that will have these pensions or Social Security expectations that's going to be the most of their retirement income, they might not save a ton in their 401ks. So you might only have like a 4% 401k contribution at this level. The other thing that I see happen is, and I saw this when I was working at for a little bit, I worked at a call center for a retirement plan provider. And the most common call that we got was people calling in to cash out their retirements or take a loan from their 401k. And it was very often for really good reasons. People needed to cover the rent, or they had a big trip that they wanted to pay for, or they needed to, buy a car, renovate their house or something. And so people need a piggy bank to do that. And the biggest pot of money most people have in the lower middle class is going to be their retirement savings. So I think that the first thing you need to do is if you're in this income level, you have to view your retirement as something that cannot be touched. You just really cannot touch it. If you touch your retirement, it really blows up everything because you pay penalty taxes, you pay a higher marginal tax rate to touch your retirement, and then the 401k loans are often not paid back. People think of it as borrowing from yourself. Well, that's a terrible idea because what usually happens is you forget to pay back the 401k, and then the 401k loan defaults, and you have to pay taxes on the withdrawal and penalty taxes as well. What would be something that's better if you're in the lower middle class? Instead of doing the 4% to retirement to break into the middle class, you could think of your retirement as something you want to do 10% into instead of 4%. In other words, instead of doing the minimum to get the 401k match, do 10% of your income instead of 4%. It's not easy, but it's a lot better because it requires mental effort to go in and change the withholding percentage. Kind of a weird idea, weird concept, right? That most people only do 4% of their retirement and get the match and they're done. But that's really what most Americans do. That's because the median retirement balance at retirement's around $50,000, and that's it. So the typical amount of money people have at retirement is 5 figures. It's like 65. Hopefully, you know that you can get to a much higher level than that. But just consider that for a moment, that the typical person out there, has a middle 5-figure amount for retirement, which means that they're completely dependent upon Social Security, right? That's what that really tells you. Another thing you could do in the lower middle class is also increase your earnings. How would you do that at this level? At this level, probably your professional job doesn't necessarily bring in as much money as a very smart side hustle might. So, for example, my English teacher waited tables at a high-end restaurant on the weekends in the summer because he was off and liked to surf, and we lived near the beach, and he was going to be local anyway. So by working, Friday, Saturday, Sunday in a high-end restaurant, he's able to pull in maybe a 10%, 20% higher amount of money for the year just by something that he doesn't mind too much. So there's a reasonable kind of side hustle or earnings enhancement that you can do in the lower middle class that can help boost your financial security as well. So now let's talk about middle class. So middle class is probably what most of you are in by my arbitrary definition. So you're probably putting money into retirement at a pretty good rate and putting a little bit of money into brokerage. So at this level, what people often do is they are susceptible to what they see online and what they hear their friends doing, and maybe they're doing some little bit of rental investing or thinking about it. Maybe they own a home. Maybe they have a fund account where they buy some different cryptos. Maybe they're doing meme stock investing, or maybe they just have a brokerage account and they're throwing a little bit of money in Apple stock every month because they heard that's good. In other words, like the middle class typical person doesn't have a lot of investment discipline. You have extra money. The median income in America, like 50, 60,000, right? So if you're earning above that, especially as an individual, by definition, you have excess funds available compared to most people. And so those excess funds usually end up somewhere. If you're a decent saver, then they're going to end up random places because most people have a random approach to their investing strategy. In terms of how do you move up by earning more once you make it to the middle class, there's something called a personal board of directors. It was kind of really in vogue when I was in corporate America. I don't know if it still is, but I think it's a great idea. So if you're middle class, the primary path upwards in terms of your economic mobility is probably going to be to increase your earnings, possibly at the job that you're at. So at big companies or organizations, people that get promoted tend to have allies and promoters. Again, your personal board of directors, right? Asking for quick coffee chats, meetings, just basically having people that support you and support your career is very important. This can also lead to discrimination, right? Like if you have a lot of people that look like you and you build your personal board of directors with a bunch of other white guys that are powerful, right? Like that can lead to discrimination. So you want to reach out across different backgrounds. You want to make sure that your personal board of directors is diverse, and you want to make sure that you realize that in big organizations, things are very political in terms of who advances and who doesn't, and it's kind of not as obvious, I would say sometimes. So you can work really hard and still be overlooked in a big organization. I just thought I would mention that because I've heard that from a lot of people that are senior level managers at organizations and high leadership roles. It's like, how did you get here? Well, you had really good mentors. Well, how do you get good mentors? Well, you want to identify people that are from a broad swath of the company that can help support your career, and then you obviously need to be able to support them as well, or at least be willing to, and support others beneath you as well. So kind of a weird idea. Maybe that won't land with some of you, but I just have heard that a lot. So you want to also, as a middle-class person, transition away from lottery-type investing to long-term strategic investing. Let me give you an example of this. There's a musical called In the Heights that was on HBO, and we watched it in the theaters too, by Lin-Manuel Miranda, the guy that did Hamilton, and it was so good. Oh my gosh. Like, I really love the music. I play a lot of them. Our 10-month-old, like, we hold her up and she, like, tries to dance to it, or at least I kind of move her feet and pretend I tell myself that it's dancing. But one of the songs in this musical is called, I think, 96,000. And it's about this $96,000 lottery ticket. And people are singing about what they would do with it. And a lot of people are talking about what they'd spend it on. And a lot of people are talking about, like, random things they would use it on. And it's kind of like their business idea or something. One of the guys says he'd go to business school and pay the entrance fee, one of the male leads. And that's actually really smart because at the middle class level, education will still allow you to go a lot higher. So there's definitely a ceiling based on education in terms of how much you can get promoted to. So let's say you have that personal board of directors, people at different levels of a company that support your career. There are still levels above which you can't pass. For example, if you don't have a PhD, it'd be pretty hard to be president of a research university, right? If you don't have some sort of master's degree from a decent school, it might be hard to advance into being, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. If you are, not a physician or a nurse, it'd be hard to become chief medical officer of a hospital system, right? So there are degrees that are just necessary if you want to continue advancing in that middle class level upwards, right? One thing I've read this year, too, with increased awareness with social justice is that women, and in particular minority women, oftentimes feel like they have to get more degrees than other people to be taken, seriously at the same level. So whatever education that you need to feel very confident that you can make it to whatever career goal that you have, go get it. Go to the best value grad school that you can. I think undergrad matters a little bit less than your terminal degree, right? So keep in mind, what this could mean is, let's say you're deciding between two different med schools. Well, you know that public service loan forgiveness is the thing. So then rather than choosing your med school based on cost, what you might do instead is look and see what kind of roles people have and what kind of residencies that they're accepted into after finishing that medical school program, right? And say, is that where I want to be? So you kind of want to think, what's the degree that I really need to be successful? And in some cases, like startup culture, entrepreneurial world, it kind of doesn't matter what your degree is so much as it matters what your personal network is. And for places that are more regimented, more structured, more hierarchical, right? Like healthcare, big business, government, academia, then having your degree be from a prestigious place, it has a really powerful network of alumni and stuff is pretty important. And then what happens is you go to a top program like that, and then you can get people on your personal board of directors that share that school network in common with you that might otherwise not give you the time of day. So, for example, one executive that helped me out in my career when I was in big business was somebody I went to the same undergrad program with. And so we could talk about SEC sports, for example. And that was kind of an interest in common where it gave me an excuse to ask him to have a coffee. So I think that that's really important to do that. I think it would help you out if your goal is to advance up like a corporate ladder kind of thing and make additional earnings. Just some random thoughts there. So now let's talk about upper middle class. Upper middle class is you're making plenty of money, let's say comfortably 6 figures. And how much of that's going to go into assets? So to get into the wealthy level, there's really kind of 2 paths you can take. You can become an investor, or you can become an owner, or a combination of those things. So once you're making like a decent amount of income, you can sort of ask yourself, which one of the two do you want to be more? So if you are somebody that's not as interested in becoming sort of a business owner, or at least having like a big part of your earnings be based off of your production, then becoming an investor is probably the more straightforward path. For physicians, for example, you have a lot of different pre-tax and tax-deferred accounts to utilize that most don't. As an example, a physician might have a 401a, which is like a required percentage of your pay that's getting deducted. You might have a 403b, and then you also might have a 457. The 457 and the 403b, that might be close to 40 grand tax-free you can put away. The 401a might be 10 to 15 grand, so you could be putting away as much as like 50 to 55K tax-free. And then you also have things like health savings accounts and backdoor Roth IRAs that you could do. Other people that are making a good amount of income, like dentists, might only have a 401k and a backdoor Roth, but a dentist might have additional options. For example, a dentist that's paid on a 1099 might be able to do an SEP IRA and put as much as $50-something thousand away pre-tax. So if you're going to be an investor, you're going to maximize all the different accounts that you have access to and utilize those in the smartest way with low-cost investments. With, obviously decent exposure to the stock market, given how the bond market is so poor right now. Either way, you also need large brokerage account contributions. If you're making a solid 6-figure income, ideally you're doing $1,000 a month to brokerage account investing outside of retirement. Hopefully you're also avoiding being house poor by not getting sucked into the idea that a home is always a great investment. It's a place that you live, and so you want to limit that house price to less than 3 times your income as a household. Hopefully, if you want to retire much sooner than the typical age, hopefully 2.5 or 2 times your household income or less. So if you're going to be an owner instead of an investor, you can kind of be also both, right? But if you're thinking about going into that wealthy category by being an owner, how do you capture the owner's share of the value of your labor? In other words, the return from risk from having you do something, how do you capture that? So this could be as a sole practitioner owner, that you could be a partner. You could have a series of businesses, right? You could have multi-site practices as a dentist. You could have a law practice that you're a partner in. Or you could just be a physician who's paid primarily on production, where you're getting a lot of your income based off of how much you're producing. So to think about someone who's making money from labor, it's more of a fixed risk return kind of trade-off, right? Whereas if you are making an owner's share of earnings off of that labor. So for example, dentists, your typical dentist salary as a employee dentist is, you can kind of back into it and find that it's 25 to 35% of the revenues that you're generating. A lot of times they'll show that as $10,000 a month or $15,000 a month, or they'll offer you a flat salary or a daily percentage of collections, whichever is higher. But in general, it's going to be between those levels. Owner dentists, in contrast, typically will have earnings that are like 40 to 50% of revenues. They're higher. And why is that? It's because as the owner dentist, you capture additional revenues from being the one that takes the market risk of operating the practice. So that's just an example of how you can break into the wealthy category by being an owner. So there's no restriction on you having to, if you're working poor, well, you don't have to break into, lower middle class and then work to middle class and then work to upper middle class. That's not really how you have to do it, right? You can become an owner or an investor at any level. I just figured I would share that because a lot of times people always want to talk about, well, what socioeconomic level am I at? Am I in a socioeconomic level that will make me happy? Well, in reality, it doesn't matter what level you find yourself at. I mean, at the end of the day, my dad was considered himself lower middle class, and he had a great retirement and could buy most things that he really wanted to buy. And yeah, he had to make some sacrifices in terms of what house he lived in and how often he bought a new car. But, he was fairly happy with that. I think that the key thing is contentment is a real issue in our society, right? So if you're always kind of looking at, oh my gosh, my life would be so much better if I got to the next level, you definitely want to try to avoid that. Because, I'll tell you, as somebody that has more financial assets than I thought I would have, who's blessed enough to feel that way, it never stops where you're like, oh my gosh, like, I've made it. That's why I warn people about when you pay off your student loan debt, it doesn't give you the feeling in a lot of cases that you think it will. You pay off your student loans or you pay off your mortgage and you're thinking it's going to be this massive party where you're so happy, or you get PSLF, right? And you have your loans forgiven and you're so happy. And that's true. You are so happy. You're ecstatic until then that high eventually wears off. And then there's something else that takes up space in your mind that gives you worries or anxiety. And so that's why it's just important to think about these things in terms of, if you want to build financial success for your family, you can kind of identify where you're at. And then, obviously, if you are somebody in the working poor, it might be a lot easier to track your spending and try to find a good program to go to school for and try to increase your earnings and try to make sure you don't use high-cost loan services and predatory loan places, right? That might be an easier first step than going out and trying to become an owner from day one and trying to open your own business, right? It might be kind of good to try to work your way up these intermediate steps. And why do you do that? It is for increased financial security. It's giving yourself more options. It's giving you more flexibility in your life so that if you ever want to make a change or you need to make a change, you're capable of doing that versus feeling stuck. And notice, too, that there is a difference between what's called balance sheet affluent and income statement affluent. That's a term I'm stealing from The Millionaire Next Door, which is a great book. And it talks about how a lot of times people define wealth as how much money do you make? That's what people want to know, right? How much money do you have? How much money do you make? And, a lot of times people will look at a resident physician and think that person's rich. Well, that's because their future expected income is high, but it's not currently high. It's not currently large. So I think a lot of society will look at income and determine that as affluence, whereas in reality, it's more assets, and even better, it's assets relative to spending. So if you spend $40,000 a year and you have $1.5 million in assets, you're very wealthy because you're financially independent, because you're spending times 25 that number. You have more money than the financial independence definition, right? Your assets are greater than 25 times your annual spending. If you have $5 million of assets and you earn, let's say you spend $1 million a year and you have $5 million of assets, are you wealthy? Well, by most conventional metrics, yes, you are. But because you're spending so much relative to your assets, maybe you are not quite as wealthy as you would think. So these are just some areas to grow wealth in. I think that what you're going to see from our podcast here is we've been trying to do a little bit of different kinds of shows with the student loan pause. Eventually, though, there's going to be a massive amount to talk about with the servicers changing, the student loan payments starting up again, with discussions of what they're doing with the negotiated rulemaking the Biden administration is doing that could affect changes with public service loan forgiveness and maybe new income-driven repayment plans. There will be things that happen in the refinancing market that we will want to update you on. We're working on putting together new resource pages for different kinds of other kind of loans that a lot of high-income professionals like you need to get the best deal on to have a really good financial trajectory. So we've been talking about some of these random things. I hope you've enjoyed some of these types of shows. They're going to get a lot more student loan specific, I think, as we get closer and closer to the end of the student loan pause. If you have questions that you want answered surrounding that, by the way, go to studentloanplanner.com/voicemail, and you can always leave a quick 10 to 30 second question that we'll answer on a show. And if you need a student loan plan, my expectation is that we're going to get very, 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 very busy starting around 30 days before the end of the student loan interest pause. So whenever that's announced, just know that that's what we're expecting is about 30 days before that pause ends. We're going to start getting more busy, and I think that we might have enough consults to handle all the requests that we might get for follow-up consults and initial consults, but I'm not sure about that. So hopefully we're all good and we're all set. If you want to kind of get out in front of that, of course, you can book a plan before that 30 days before the interest pause happens. I think a fair number of people have been doing that this past week from what I can see. Just know that we're going to do our very best to try to serve everybody whenever that does happen, but that we will see probably a pretty large spike all at once of a bunch of people asking questions all at once. So we will do our very best to handle that, to help you through that process. But feel free to reach out, studentloanplanner.com/help if you need a student loan plan. And we are continuing to see record amounts of student loan refinancing with rates at a basically combined record low, because you've got interest rates are super low and credit risk is super, super low. So those two things happening at the same time, it's never quite happened like this before. So a lot of people that have even refinanced like 3 months ago are applying, going to studentloanplanner.com/refi, and they're finding better deals that are lower by 0.2% or more, which is just kind of crazy if you think about it. So you can think if you need to apply for that, and reach out if you have any questions about the pod or that you want to ask on the pod with the voicemail link. And thank you so much for listening to this show. I hope you've enjoyed. It's kind of a little bit random, today's show, talking about advancing up the economic ladder, different things you would need to do at different income levels to break through to the next level of the economic ladder. But I hope you found it fun. Also, if you have other ideas for shows, we love getting those too. So reach out, podcast@studentloanplanner.com for those. Thank you so much for being a listener of the Student Loan Planner podcast. Until next time, I'm Travis Hornsby. Thank you for listening.